Magpies by Thomas King explores how the mass assimilation inflicted generations ago on the indigenous peoples have left them feeling pressured between choosing to preserve their cultural identities or adapt to modern society, resulting in an ongoing internal struggle. In modern society, Canadians are more open to indigenous communities and learning about them. Although the country is stepping towards reconciliation, indigenous communities are still suffering from Canada's past mistakes and are struggling to reconnect with their past cultures and traditions. Indigenous peoples do not preserve their traditions in the way that Western Canadians do. Wampum belts are a good example of these practices. In the 16th centuries, wampum belts became very popular amongst indigenous communities, specifically the Onondaga and the Haudenosaunee tribes. They would take the shell of a clam, shave it down, sand it, and then drill it to create a bead. They would then weave it to a series of strings to create a belt. The Onondaga and the Haudenosaunee would take these belts and use them as legal contracts and treaties with one another. To this day, these tribes still continue to use wampum as a form of communication and legalities. The indigenous also share knowledge through gathered storytelling, language, dancing, art, etc. The Indian Act. The Indian Act was established in 1867. This is an act which states how the indigenous would live and was aimed to assimilate their culture and convert them into mainstream Europeans. This act removed the voices of indigenous peoples, politically disenfranchising them. For generations, the indigenous have had to go through the many processes of assimilation through various aspects, a main one being residential schools. Residential schools have had a large impact on the loss of indigenous culture today. In indigenous communities, elders carry the most knowledge and pass it on to their children before they die. In the 1800s, residential schools became mandatory for every person under the Indian Act from the ages of 5 to 17 years old to attend. These schools attempted to erase all indigenous culture from the children to create a generation of modern Canadians. Although the last residential school closed down in 1997, over 20 years ago, its assimilation effects are still long-lasting and affect many indigenous Canadians to this day. When interviewed, Doreen Bernard, a residential school survivor, states how
teachers, and unfortunately many of the fluent speakers in our community have passed on, and there's not that many. There's maybe 5 out of 2,000 people from our community that actually can speak fluent Mi'kmaq. Language is really important to who we are. So it's something that I struggle with, but I'm learning. I'm learning to pray in Mi'kmaq, and I'm learning to some words and phrases, and trying to revive that and instill in my grandkids, that it's really important that they learn.
Doreen was sent to the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School in 1961 at just 4 years old, and left in 1967 when she was 10. 64 years later, Bernard continues to struggle with learning her language and recovering from the mass assimilation and trauma inflicted on her and her communities. The Indian Act has horribly affected Indigenous culture, and as seen by Doreen Bernard, can result in the issue of the loss of cultural identity. This shows how now, more than ever, the Indigenous must preserve their lasting history and traditions so that it can grow and develop for future generations and become what it first was. Relation to magpies. The short story Magpies by Thomas King relates to the issues of preserving indigenous identities while facing the modernization of current society. When Granny is talking about her death, she asks Wilma and Ambrose to lay her body in the Heavyfields tree. An indigenous tree burial, the act of laying a person's corpse in a tree, is a common practice done by the Anishinaabe and the Sui people. Granny's wishes to have a tree burial represents the indigenous traditions and wanting to preserve them for as long as possible. Wilma's acts of going against Granny's request and burying her in a grave represents the forced colonization and assimilation done by modern Canadians to the Indigenous. Ambrose's choice between following modern society with the grave burial or choosing to respect Granny's tree burial tradition represents Indigenous peoples today. They are stuck on whether or not they should fall into mainstream Canadian culture or continue on their ancestors' legacy. What have we done to help with the issue of lost tradition? In Canada, we have and are attempting to reconcile to the Indigenous peoples who suffered from our wrongdoings. To reconcile, we have done number 1, land acknowledgements. A lot of areas in Canada have begun to recognize that the lands once belonged to the Indigenous people and now have a land acknowledgement, which states that the Indigenous were once on this land before them. By understanding that the land belongs to the Indigenous, mainstream Canadians can look at the past and begin the first steps to apologizing and reconciling to the Indigenous. Places in Toronto, Port Credit, and many other areas in Ontario have these acknowledgements. Everybody living on Indigenous land should own a land acknowledgement to be educated on the past and begin a better future. 2. The UN Declaration Act. In 2021, Canada decided to launch the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. This act essentially states that the Canadian government will try their best to ensure that the Indigenous peoples' voices are heard, are treated kindly, and will do anything to help the Indigenous peoples. This act should have been implemented many years ago, however it is great to know that Canadian people care enough to put an act out to be able to respect Indigenous peoples. Number 3, the NBE3 class. Some Ontario-based school district boards like TDSB and PDSB have made it mandatory for all 11th grade students to take an Indigenous-based course. This is so that students can be more informed on Indigenous peoples to spread the message. By sharing Indigenous traditions with people from young generations, this will allow for a good preservation of Indigenous culture and make sure that it does not die in the future. So what can we as students do to help? Number 1, we can learn about Indigenous culture. By going out of our way to learn about Indigenous culture, students can help preserve Indigenous traditions and help them be remembered. A way we can do this is through our NBE 3 classes. If any of us have this class, we can go out of our way to do more research than we were asked to learn about the Indigenous peoples and keep their culture alive. Number 2, participate in Indigenous-based days. September 30th is Orange Shirt Day. This day is to acknowledge those who have suffered due to residential schools and have lost their traditions. By being aware of this reason, wearing an orange shirt and telling others, we can help raise awareness for Indigenous struggles, which can lead us to reconciliation. By participating in events and activities which are Indigenous-led, we can allow ourselves to gain a better understanding of who they are and why we are celebrating these days. Number 3, buy from Indigenous communities. When needing to buy a school bag, a trinket, or really anything, consider buying from a vendor who will give the proceeds to Indigenous communities. In To Be Indian in Canada Today by Richard Wagameses, he states how, on reserves, in Métis communities and in the cities, Aboriginal children go hungry, lack warm clothing and solid educational resources, die as infants at a rate 2 to 4 times the national average, and endure immunization rates 20 times lower than the general population. They suffer because different orders of government distribute who's responsible to pay or provide for a service. Although the Canadian government is helping, many Indigenous peoples today still struggle with money and to afford simple essentials like clothes or medicine, resulting in higher infant death rates. By financially supporting Indigenous funding companies/sellers, a student is likely to help these communities get back on their feet for a better future. Overall, Indigenous peoples today struggle to find their lost traditions. Much of their culture has been forgotten due to Canada's past actions. However, by learning from Canada's history and reconciling with the Indigenous, we can create a better future for mainstream Canadians and Indigenous Canadians and come together to create new traditions.